Hello and welcome. If the D080 OA exam has been on your mind and you're wondering how to approach it, then you're in the right place. On our website, you'll find a complete collection of questions and answers designed specifically for the D080 OA exam, and it's entirely free. We know how stressful these assessments can be, so we've put together free exam guides and practice questions to make you prepared. In this video, we'll be tackling questions across 5 key areas: globalization and trade theories, economic systems and policies, trade barriers and protectionism, international financial institutions, foreign direct investments. So let's get into it. 1. A company in one country begins regularly sharing technology and cultural products with firms in multiple other nations, creating growing economic ties. Which term best describes this increasing cross-border interdependence of economies, cultures, and political systems across the world? A. Protectionism, B. Mercantilism, C. Globalization, D. Outsourcing. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Globalization. Explanation: Option C is correct because globalization refers to international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and cultural aspects, driven by advances in transportation and telecommunications that connect nations economically. Option A is incorrect because protectionism refers to government policies that restrict international trade through tariffs and quotas to shield domestic industries, which is the opposite of the open exchange described in this scenario. Option B is incorrect because mercantilism is a trade theory from the 16th century that promotes exports and discourages imports to accumulate national wealth, not the broad cultural and economic integration described here. Option D is incorrect because outsourcing specifically refers to the practice of sending production work to locations with cheaper labor, which is only one narrow component of broader international business activity. All right, let's break down the core concept behind this question. The scenario describes a company in one country that starts sharing technology and cultural products with firms across multiple nations, creating growing economic ties. That right there is globalization, the increasing cross-border interdependence of economies, cultures, and political systems worldwide. Think of it this way: globalization is what happens when advances in transportation and telecommunications make it easier for countries to exchange not just goods, but ideas, worldviews, and cultural practices. It's a big-picture concept that covers everything from trade to cultural exchange to political cooperation. Now, why are the other options wrong? Protectionism is actually the opposite. It's when governments use tariffs and quotas to block foreign goods and shield domestic industries. Mercantilism is an old 16th century idea about hoarding gold by exporting more than you import, and outsourcing is way too narrow. It just means sending production work to cheaper locations, which is only one small piece of the globalization puzzle. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When you see a question describing broad cross-border exchange of goods, ideas, and culture between multiple nations, that's your signal for globalization. Quick recall hook: globalization equals global integration. Multiple countries, multiple dimensions, all connected. 2. The International Monetary Fund identified 4 fundamental aspects of globalization in the year 2000. A researcher is studying how workers relocate across national borders to fill labor shortages abroad. Which fundamental aspect of globalization does this researcher's focus most directly represent? A. Migration and movement of people. B. Trade and transactions. C. Dissemination of knowledge. D. Capital and investment movements. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Migration and movement of people. Explanation: Option A is correct because the IMF identified migration and movement of people as one of 4 fundamental aspects of globalization, which directly covers workers relocating across national borders to address labor demands abroad. Option B is incorrect because trade and transactions refers to the cross-border exchange of goods and services between countries, not the physical relocation of workers seeking employment opportunities in foreign labor markets. Option C is incorrect because the dissemination of knowledge involves the spread of information, ideas, and technology across borders, which does not directly address the physical movement of workers to other nations. Option D is incorrect because capital and investment movements refers to the flow of money and financial resources across national borders, not the migration of individual workers seeking employment in foreign countries. Let's dig into the theory behind this one. The International Monetary Fund identified 4 fundamental aspects of globalization in the year 2000. Those 4 are trade and transactions, capital and investment movements, migration and movement of people, and dissemination of knowledge. The question tells us a researcher is studying workers relocating across national borders to fill labor shortages. That maps directly to migration and movement of people. It's about humans physically moving from one country to another for work. Trade and transactions covers goods and services crossing borders, not people. Capital and investment movements is about money and financial resources flowing between countries. And dissemination of knowledge is about spreading ideas, information, and technology. None of those describe workers physically relocating. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions workers physically moving to another country for employment, that's migration and movement of people every time. Quick recall hook. People moving equals migration. Workers crossing borders, filling jobs abroad. 3. A small island nation notices its traditional music and local crafts are being replaced by Western pop culture and mass-produced goods from large multinational companies. Anti-globalization movements have emerged in response to this growing concern. What is this cultural shift commonly described as? A. Cultural divergence. B. Political integration. C. Economic liberalization. D. Cultural homogenization. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Cultural homogenization. Explanation: Option D is correct because cultural globalization has been accompanied by decreased uniqueness of once isolated communities, and many argue this process represents the global domination of Western culture at the expense of smaller cultures. Option A is incorrect because cultural divergence describes cultures becoming more different from one another over time, which is the opposite of the scenario where local traditions are being replaced by dominant Western culture. Option B is incorrect because political integration refers to nations unifying their governmental policies and institutions through agreements or unions, not the replacement of traditional cultural practices by foreign pop culture. Option C is incorrect because economic liberalization describes the removal of government restrictions on trade and business activities, which does not directly address the loss of cultural identity and traditional practices described here. This is a concept you'll definitely see on exam day, so let's get into it. The question describes a small island nation watching its traditional music and local crafts get replaced by Western pop culture and mass-produced goods from big multinational companies. That phenomenon is called cultural homogenization, where globalization causes local cultures to lose their uniqueness as a dominant culture, usually Western, takes over. Anti-globalization movements have pushed back hard against this, arguing that smaller cultures are getting swallowed up. Now, cultural divergence is the opposite. That's when cultures become more different from each other over time, not more alike. Political integration is about nations merging their governmental policies and institutions, like forming a political union. Economic liberalization is about removing government restrictions on trade and business. Neither of those addresses the loss of cultural identity happening here. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When you see local traditions being replaced by dominant foreign culture, especially Western culture, think cultural homogenization immediately. Quick recall hook. Homogenization equals homogeneous, everything becoming the same. 4. Several nations have agreed to establish a shared court system to resolve cross-border disputes and enforce international laws that no single country could manage alone. Which type of institution best represents this shift of authority away from individual nation-states toward cooperative governance? A. Non-governmental organization. B. Supranational institution. C. Domestic regulatory agency. D. Bilateral trade agreement. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Supranational institution. Explanation. Option B is correct because supranational institutions like the European Union and the International Criminal Court serve to replace or extend national functions, facilitating international agreement and reducing the sole importance of individual nation-states. Option A is incorrect because non-governmental organizations are private entities that influence public policy and provide humanitarian aid, but they do not hold the governmental authority or legal jurisdiction described in this scenario. Option C is incorrect because a domestic regulatory agency operates within a single country to enforce national laws and regulations, and it lacks the international scope and cross-border legal authority described in the question. Option D is incorrect because a bilateral trade agreement is a pact between only two countries focused on reducing trade barriers, which does not represent the broader multinational governance structure with shared legal authority described here. Let's explore the theory behind these types of institutions to see why one answer fits perfectly here. The scenario describes several nations agreeing to create a shared court system for cross-border disputes and international law enforcement. That's a supranational institution, an entity where member nations transfer some of their authority to a larger, cooperative governing body. Think of the European Union or the International Criminal Court. These institutions replace or extend national functions so countries can handle problems no single government could manage alone. A non-governmental organization or NGO is a private entity. Groups like the Red Cross, they influence policy and provide aid, but they don't hold governmental authority or legal jurisdiction over nations. A domestic regulatory agency operates within one country's borders to enforce that country's own laws. It has zero international reach, and a bilateral trade agreement is just a deal between two countries to reduce trade barriers. It doesn't create a shared legal system with authority over multiple nations. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When you see nations giving up some authority to a shared governing body, that's a supranational institution. The key word is authority shifting away from individual countries to a cooperative entity. Quick recall hook. Supranational equals supranational, above any single nation. 5. According to Friedman, the most recent stage of globalization began around the year 2000 and was driven primarily by advances in global electronic connectivity. What distinguishes this stage from the two earlier stages in terms of who holds the driving power behind global integration? A. Individuals communicating with unlimited potential. B. Large multinational corporations expanding markets. C. National governments exerting industrial power. D. Religious institutions spreading cultural values. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Individuals communicating with unlimited potential. Explanation. Option A is correct because Friedman's Globalization 3.0, which began around 2000, was driven by software advances and electronic interconnectivity that empowered individuals to communicate and collaborate worldwide with unprecedented potential. Option B is incorrect because large multinational corporations were the primary drivers during Globalization 2.0, which spanned from roughly 1800 to 2000, shaped by emerging corporate power and mercantile expansion. Option C is incorrect because national governments exerting industrial power characterized Globalization 1.0, spanning from 1492 to 1800, where country-level industrial capacity drove global interactions and exploration. Option D is incorrect because religious institutions spreading cultural values is not identified by Friedman as a defining driver in any of the three stages of globalization, though religion was a motivation in the first stage. To really understand why this answer is correct, let's walk through Thomas Friedman's three stages of globalization. Friedman broke globalization into three eras, and what makes each stage different is who held the driving power. Globalization 1.0 ran from 1492 to around 1800. This was the era of countries. National governments and their industrial power drove global exploration and expansion. Globalization 2.0 ran from roughly 1800 to the year 2000. This was the era of companies. Big multinational corporations became the main engine of global integration, expanding into new markets everywhere. Then came Globalization 3.0, starting around 2000. This is the era of individuals, software advances and electronic interconnectivity. The internet, email, collaboration tools gave individual people the power to communicate, compete, and collaborate globally with unprecedented reach. No corporation or government needed. The other options are wrong because they describe the wrong era. Multinationals drove stage 2, governments drove stage 1. And religious institutions aren't identified as a primary driver in any of Friedman's three stages. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. Friedman's stages follow a pattern: countries, then companies, then people. If the question mentions the year 2000 and electronic connectivity, that's Globalization 3.0, and the answer is individuals. Quick recall hook: 3.0 equals three letters. U, the individual. 6. A manufacturer currently produces smartphones entirely in one country, but now wants to build screens in South Korea, assemble processors in Taiwan, and complete final assembly in Vietnam. Which stage of going global best describes this strategy of splitting production across multiple optimal locations? A. Market entry. B. Product specialization. C. Value chain reengineering. D. Value chain disaggregation. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Value chain disaggregation. Explanation. Option D is correct because value chain disaggregation is the stage where companies break apart their production process and complete each activity in the most advantageous location, with individual components manufactured in several different places. Option A is incorrect because market entry is the first stage where companies enter new countries using business models similar to their home markets, primarily to gain access to local customers rather than splitting production. Option B is incorrect because product specialization is the second stage where companies transfer the full production process of a specific product to a single low-cost location, not splitting components across multiple countries. Option C is incorrect because value chain reengineering is the fourth stage, where companies further increase cost savings by adapting their processes to suit local market conditions, substituting lower-cost labor for capital investments. This question is about the stages of going global, and it's testing a specific one. The scenario describes a manufacturer that currently builds smartphones entirely in one country, but now wants to split things up. Screens in South Korea, processors in Taiwan, final assembly in Vietnam. That's value chain disaggregation. It's the stage where a company takes its production process apart and puts each piece in the most advantageous location worldwide. Each component gets manufactured wherever it makes the most sense for cost, quality, or expertise. Now, market entry is just the first stage. A company enters a new country using its existing home market approach, mainly to access local customers. Product specialization is the second stage, where the entire production of one product moves to a single, low-cost location. That's different from splitting components across multiple places. and value chain reengineering is the fourth stage, where companies go further by adapting their processes to suit local conditions and substituting cheaper labor for capital investments. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. The keyword is splitting. If production is broken into pieces and each piece goes to a different country for optimization, that's value chain disaggregation. Quick recall hook. Disaggregation equals disaggregate, taking apart, spreading out. 7. A European clothing brand decides to move its entire jeans manufacturing operation to a single factory in Bangladesh, where labor and materials are significantly cheaper, and then exports the finished jeans back to retail markets across Europe. Which stage of going global does this represent? A. Product specialization. B. Value chain disaggregation. C. Creation of new markets. D. Market entry. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, A. Product specialization. Explanation: option A is correct because product specialization involves transferring the full production process of a particular product to a single low-cost location and then exporting the finished goods to various consumer markets around the world. Option B is incorrect because value chain disaggregation involves splitting different parts of the production process across multiple locations to optimize each step, rather than consolidating full production in one single location. Option C is incorrect because creation of new markets is the fifth and final stage that focuses on expanding market demand and lowering prices in both old and new markets, not on centralizing production in one location. Option D is incorrect because market entry is the first stage where companies enter new countries using their existing home market business model, primarily seeking local customers, rather than centralizing manufacturing for global export. Here's another stages of going global question, and this one tests a different stage from the last. A European clothing brand moves its entire jeans manufacturing operation to a single factory in Bangladesh, cheap labor, cheap materials, and then exports finished jeans back to Europe. That's product specialization. The key difference from disaggregation is that the entire production of one product goes to one location, everything happens in Bangladesh, nothing is split across multiple countries. Market entry doesn't fit because the company isn't entering Bangladesh to sell jeans to Bangladeshi customers. It's using Bangladesh purely as a production base. Value chain disaggregation, as we just covered, involves splitting different parts of production across multiple locations, not consolidating everything in one place. And creation of new markets is the fifth and final stage, which focuses on expanding demand and reaching new consumer bases, not on where production happens. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. The distinction between product specialization and disaggregation comes down to one place versus many. If all production moves to one cheap location, it's specialization. If production splits across several countries, it's disaggregation. Quick recall hook: specialization equals one special place, one product, one location. 8. Consumers in Japan, Germany, and Brazil are all increasingly demanding the same style of wireless earbuds with similar features and quality. A tech firm sees a chance to produce one standardized product at high volume for all three markets. Which industry globalization driver creates this opportunity? A. Government drivers. B. Competition drivers. C. Market drivers. D. Cost drivers. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, C. Market drivers. Explanation: option C is correct because market drivers provide opportunities for economies of scale through the convergence of customer needs, as consumers in different parts of the world increasingly demand similar products and standardized offerings. Option A is incorrect because government drivers relate to favorable trade policies, technical standards, regulations, and government-operated competitors or customers, not the convergence of consumer preferences across different international markets. Option B is incorrect because competition drivers relate to industry characteristics such as export and import volume, national diversity of competitors, and the extent to which major players have already globalized their operations. Option D is incorrect because cost drivers involve exploiting differences in production costs across countries for manufacturing and sourcing, not the convergence of consumer demand that enables standardized products across multiple markets. Let's get into industry globalization drivers here, because this is one of those concepts that shows up in several different question patterns. The scenario says consumers in Japan, Germany, and Brazil all want the same style of wireless earbuds, similar features, similar quality. A tech firm sees the chance to make one standardized product at high volume. That opportunity exists because of market drivers. Market drivers are about the convergence of customer needs. When people in different countries start wanting the same things, companies can produce one product for everyone and benefit from economies of scale. Government drivers are a different thing entirely. Those involve favorable trade policies, technical standards, and regulations that make it easier to operate internationally. Competition drivers relate to how globalized your competitors already are, the volume of imports and exports in your industry, and the diversity of players in the space. And cost drivers are about exploiting differences in production costs across countries, cheaper labor here, cheaper materials there. The question isn't about cheaper production, it's about demand converging across markets. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When customers in multiple countries want the same product, that's market drivers. The keyword is convergence of customer needs. Quick recall hook, market drivers equal market demand. Same wants, same product. 9. A footwear company discovers that raw materials cost significantly less in Vietnam, and manufacturing wages are a fraction of those in its home country. The firm decides to relocate production to take advantage of these price differences. Which industry globalization driver is most influencing this decision? A. Market drivers, B. Cost drivers, C. Government drivers, D. Competition drivers. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Cost drivers. Explanation: Option B is correct because cost drivers involve exploiting differences in costs for manufacturing, sourcing, and production factors across different parts of the world, including cheaper raw materials and lower wage rates. Option A is incorrect because market drivers focus on the convergence of consumer needs and opportunities for economies of scale through standardized offerings, not on exploiting differences in raw material and labor costs abroad. Option C is incorrect because government drivers involve favorable trade policies, regulations, technical standards, and government-operated or subsidized competitors, not the cost differences in raw materials and labor across countries. Option D is incorrect because competition drivers relate to industry characteristics like export and import volumes, national diversity of competitors, and the degree to which rival firms have already globalized their own operations. All right, now we flip to the other side of globalization drivers. A footwear company finds that raw materials cost way less in Vietnam, and manufacturing wages are a fraction of what they pay at home, so they relocate production. That decision is driven by cost drivers. Cost drivers are about exploiting price differences in production inputs across different countries. Raw materials, labor, energy, land, whatever makes manufacturing cheaper in one place versus another. Market drivers, by contrast, are about consumer demand converging. If customers in multiple countries want the same thing, that's a market driver. Government drivers involve trade policies, regulations, and standards. Competition drivers are about how globalized your rivals are. This scenario is strictly about cost, cheaper materials, cheaper labor, nothing about customer demand, trade policy, or competitive positioning. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question talks about cheaper labor, cheaper raw materials, or lower production costs in a foreign country, the answer is cost drivers. Quick recall hook. Cost drivers equal cheaper costs abroad, saving money on production. 10. A major electronics firm expands into a developing country but struggles because local roads are frequently impassable, the electrical grid suffers constant outages, and telecommunications networks are unreliable. Which category of challenge for multinational global expansion best describes the obstacles this firm is facing? A. Ethical business practices. B. Leadership gaps. C. Legal and regulatory structure. D. Infrastructure. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, D. Infrastructure. Explanation. Option D is correct because infrastructure includes the basic physical and organizational structures needed for a society to operate, such as roads, bridges, electrical grids, and telecommunications, and poor infrastructure makes business operations difficult. Option A is incorrect because ethical business practices refer to challenges related to labor standards, product safety, environmental stewardship, and corruption, which are behavioral and policy concerns rather than physical operational limitations. Option B is incorrect because leadership gaps refer to the difficulty of finding organizational leaders with appropriate knowledge and skills to successfully approach a given geographic market, not the physical conditions of a country. Option C is incorrect because legal and regulatory structure refers to the unique laws and regulations governing business in each nation, requiring specialized legal expertise for compliance rather than dealing with unreliable physical systems. Let's talk about what trips up multinational companies when they expand into developing countries. This electronics firm goes into a foreign country and runs into impassable roads, constant electrical outages, and unreliable telecommunications networks. That's an infrastructure problem. Infrastructure means the basic physical and organizational structures a society needs to function. Roads, bridges, power grids, communication systems, water supply. Without reliable infrastructure, everything from shipping products to keeping a factory running becomes a nightmare. Ethical business practices are about labor standards, product safety, environmental responsibility, and corruption. Those are real challenges, but they're about behavior and policy, not about roads falling apart. Leadership gaps refer to the difficulty of finding managers and executives who know the local market well enough to operate successfully. That's a talent issue, and legal and regulatory structure is about navigating the unique laws and rules governing business in each country. None of those describe the physical systems breaking down. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions roads, power grids, bridges, or telecom systems being unreliable, that's infrastructure every single time. Quick recall hook. Infrastructure equals in the structure of a country, physical stuff that makes everything run. 11. A country's government allows both private businesses and public institutions to participate in shaping laws and policies, believing that a healthy balance between individual rights and collective governance is necessary. Which political philosophy best describes this balanced approach to governing a modern state? A. Pluralism. B. Totalitarianism. C. Anarchism. D. Oligarchy. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Pluralism. Explanation. Option A is correct because pluralism asserts that both public and private groups are essential in a well-functioning political system, representing a balance between individual freedoms and government involvement in regulating society. Option B is incorrect because totalitarianism is the extreme political ideology that contends every aspect of an individual's life should be controlled and directed by a strong central government, leaving no room for private group influence. Option C is incorrect because anarchism is the opposite extreme that contends individuals should control political activities entirely on their own, and that public government oversight is completely unnecessary for society to function. Option D is incorrect because an oligarchy is a political system where a small elite group holds power based on status rather than noble ancestry, and it does not describe the balanced public-private participation in governance. This question gets into political philosophy, and the answer hinges on one word: balance. The scenario describes a government that allows both private businesses and public institutions to participate in shaping laws and policies, a healthy balance between individual rights and collective governance. That's pluralism. Pluralism says that both public and private groups are necessary for a well-functioning political system. It sits between two extremes. Totalitarianism is one extreme where the government controls every aspect of life. No private group influence, no individual freedoms. The state dominates everything. Anarchism is the other extreme, where there's no government at all. Individuals handle everything themselves with zero public oversight. And an oligarchy is a system where a small elite group holds power based on wealth or status. It doesn't describe the balanced participation between public and private groups that the question lays out. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions both private and public groups participating in governance with a balanced approach, that's pluralism. Think of it as the middle ground. Quick recall hook. Pluralism equals plural groups, multiple voices, public and private, sharing power. 12. A national government decides what factories will produce, sets all prices for consumer goods, allocates workers to specific jobs, and owns every major business in the country. Citizens have no choice in where they work or what they can purchase. Which economic system does this describe? A. Market economy. B. Mixed economy. C. Command economy. D. Traditional economy. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Command economy. Explanation: option C is correct because in a command economy, economic effort is devoted to goals set by a ruling authority, with state ownership of capital, government-controlled inputs and outputs, regulated prices, and no private ownership. Option A is incorrect because a market economy is a decentralized system where firms and consumers make decisions based on supply and demand, with private ownership, competition, profit motive, and minimal government interference in production. Option B is incorrect because a mixed economy borrows characteristics from both market and command systems, allowing private property and supply and demand pricing while still using government intervention to protect citizens and the market. Option D is incorrect because a traditional economy is the oldest system, centered around family or tribal units that rely on bartering and generational methods of trade and exchange, not centralized government control of production. This question is about economic systems, and the scenario makes the answer pretty clear once you know the definitions. A government decides what factories produce, sets all prices, allocates workers to specific jobs, and owns every major business. Citizens have zero choice in where they work or what they buy. That's a command economy. In a command economy, the government runs everything. It sets the goals, controls the inputs and outputs, owns all the capital, and regulates prices. The state calls every shot. A market economy is the opposite. It's decentralized, driven by supply and demand, with private ownership and competition. Firms and consumers make their own decisions. A mixed economy borrows from both systems. Private property exists, supply and demand set most prices, but the government steps in to protect citizens and regulate where needed. Most modern economies fall here. A traditional economy is the oldest type, based on family or tribal units using bartering and generational methods of trade. No centralized control, no industrial production. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When you see government ownership, government-controlled prices, and workers assigned to jobs, that's command economy. The key word is total government control over economic activity. Quick recall hook. Command equals commands. The government commands everything. 13. In a particular country, businesses are privately owned, consumers freely choose what to buy, and companies compete to offer lower prices and better products. The government rarely interferes with business activities or pricing decisions. Which type of economic system best fits this description? A. Command economy. B. Traditional economy. C. Mixed economy. D. Market economy. Do you know the answer?
Correct answer D. Market economy. Explanation: Option D is correct because a market economy features private ownership, freedom to choose, profit motive, competition that keeps prices low, reliance on efficient markets, and minimal government interference in how goods are produced.
Option A is incorrect because a command economy is characterized by state ownership of capital, government-determined inputs and outputs, regulated prices, and centralized control of production, which is the opposite of private ownership and competition. Option B is incorrect because a traditional economy uses methods of trade and exchange passed through generations, centered around family or tribal units with bartering and no surplus, not competitive private businesses in open markets. Option C is incorrect because a mixed economy includes significant government intervention to protect citizens and regulate the market, combining elements of command and market systems rather than operating with minimal government involvement. Now let's look at the other end of the economic spectrum. This scenario describes private business ownership, consumer freedom of choice, companies competing on price and quality, and the government rarely interfering. That's a market economy. The defining features are private ownership, freedom to choose, profit motive, competition keeping prices low, and minimal government involvement. It's driven by supply and demand, not by some central authority dictating outcomes. A command economy is the opposite: state ownership, government-determined prices, centralized control. A traditional economy relies on generational methods of trade, bartering, and family or tribal units. There's no industrial competition in a traditional system. A mixed economy has government intervention. The government steps in to regulate industries and protect citizens. The question specifically says the government rarely interferes, which rules out a mixed system. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. The phrase minimal government interference combined with private ownership and competition is a dead giveaway for market economy. Quick recall hook: market economy equals the market decides, buyers and sellers, not the government. 14. A developing nation allows private companies to operate and set their own prices based on supply and demand, but the federal government steps in to regulate industries that affect public welfare and provide social safety net programs for vulnerable citizens. Which economic model best describes this approach? A. Mixed economy. B. Command economy. C. Traditional economy. D. Market economy. What you think is the answer? Correct answer: A. Mixed economy. Explanation: Option A is correct because most modern economies are mixed, combining market features like private property and supply and demand pricing with government intervention to protect citizens, regulate industries, and minimize the disadvantages of pure market economics. Option B is incorrect because a command economy is controlled almost entirely by a centralized government authority that owns businesses, sets prices, allocates labor, and determines production outputs with no room for private enterprise. Option C is incorrect because a traditional economy uses generational methods of trade centered on family or tribal units, relying on bartering with no surplus production, which does not match the combination of private enterprise and government regulation. Option D is incorrect because a pure market economy operates with minimal government interference, relying entirely on supply, demand, and private competition, without the federal government stepping in to regulate industries or provide safety programs. This question rounds out the economic systems trio, and it describes the system most modern countries actually use. The scenario shows a developing nation that allows private companies to operate freely and set prices based on supply and demand, but the federal government steps in to regulate industries affecting public welfare and provide social safety nets. That's a mixed economy, a blend of market and command elements. Private enterprise exists alongside government intervention. The government doesn't run everything, but it doesn't sit on the sidelines either. A command economy would mean the government controls almost everything, owns businesses, sets prices, assigns labor. That's way beyond what this scenario describes. A traditional economy uses generational bartering and tribal methods of exchange, no modern regulatory framework there. And a pure market economy operates with minimal government involvement, the government staying hands-off. But this scenario explicitly says the government steps in to regulate and provide safety nets, so it can't be a pure market system. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If you see private businesses operating freely, but the government also steps in to regulate and protect, that's mixed economy. The blend is the giveaway. Quick recall hook, mixed equals mix of both, part market, part government. 15. A multinational firm is evaluating whether to invest in a foreign country. The firm discovers the country has frequent leadership changes, unpredictable shifts in business regulations, and no transparent decision-making process in government. Which primary concern should the firm prioritize when assessing this investment opportunity? A. Currency exchange rates. B. Political stability. C. Cultural distance. D. Transportation costs. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer B. Political stability. Explanation: option B is correct because political stability is a key factor in attracting foreign investment, and businesses need to assess whether frequent leadership changes and unpredictable regulatory shifts could dramatically alter the rules of doing business. Option A is incorrect because currency exchange rates relate to the monetary value between countries and international transaction costs, not the internal governmental instability and unpredictable regulatory environment described in this investment scenario. Option C is incorrect because cultural distance refers to differences in language, norms, identity, and trust between countries, which are important considerations but do not directly address the governmental instability and regulatory unpredictability described here. Option D is incorrect because transportation costs relate to the physical movement of goods and logistical expenses, which are operational considerations that are separate from the political governance and regulatory stability concerns described in the question. This one tests your ability to identify the most important risk factor when evaluating foreign investment. A multinational firm is looking at a foreign country and finds frequent leadership changes, unpredictable shifts in business regulations, and zero transparency in government decision-making. That's a political stability problem. Political stability matters because businesses need predictable rules. If the government keeps changing and regulations keep shifting without warning, a company can invest millions today and find the rules completely rewritten tomorrow. That kind of uncertainty scares off foreign investment faster than almost anything else. Currency exchange rates matter for international transactions, but that's about monetary value, not about whether the government might collapse or rewrite the law overnight. Cultural distance, differences in language, norms, and trust is a real factor, but it doesn't address the governmental chaos described here. And transportation costs are about logistics and shipping expenses, which are operational concerns, not governance risks. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question describes frequent leadership changes, unpredictable regulations, or lack of government transparency, the answer is political stability. Those are the classic signals. Quick recall hook: political stability equals predictable politics. Stable government, stable rules, safe investment. 16. Country X can produce both coffee and electronics, but it produces coffee using far fewer resources relative to its electronics output. Country Y is better at electronics. David Ricardo would argue both nations benefit if each focuses on the product where it sacrifices the least. Which trade theory is this? A. Mercantilism. B. Absolute advantage. C. Country similarity theory. D. Comparative advantage. Do you know the answer? Correct answer D. Comparative advantage. Explanation: option D is correct because comparative advantage, developed by David Ricardo, states that countries benefit from specializing in goods where they have the lowest opportunity cost, meaning the sacrifice of the next best alternative is minimized. Option A is incorrect because mercantilism is a 16th century theory focused on accumulating national wealth through maintaining a trade surplus by promoting exports, discouraging imports, and imposing protectionist restrictions on foreign goods. Option B is incorrect because absolute advantage, proposed by Adam Smith, focuses on a country's ability to produce a good more efficiently than another nation using fewer resources, without considering the relative opportunity cost comparison. Option C is incorrect because country similarity theory, developed by Stefan Linder, explains trade between countries at similar stages of economic development with similar consumer preferences, not the opportunity cost-based specialization described here. Now we're getting into the classic trade theories, and this question tests David Ricardo's comparative advantage. Here's the setup. Country X can produce both coffee and electronics, but it's relatively better at coffee. It uses far fewer resources compared to its electronics output. Country Y is better at electronics. Ricardo's argument is that both countries benefit if each focuses on the product where it sacrifices the least. That sacrifice is opportunity cost, what you give up to produce something. Comparative advantage isn't about who's the best at making something in absolute terms, it's about who gives up the least to make it. Even if one country could produce both goods more efficiently than the other, they're still better off specializing where their opportunity cost is lowest. Mercantilism is a completely different idea. It's about hoarding gold through trade surpluses and protectionist policies. That's 16th century thinking. Absolute advantage from Adam Smith asks a simpler question: who uses fewer resources overall? It doesn't factor in opportunity cost. Country similarity theory is about trade between similar economies with similar consumer tastes. It doesn't involve opportunity cost calculations at all. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions opportunity cost, sacrifice, or giving up the least, that's comparative advantage. Ricardo and opportunity cost are permanently linked. Quick recall hook. Comparative equals compare opportunity costs. Who sacrifices less? 17. Adam Smith argued in 1776 that a nation's true wealth should be measured by the living standards of its people, not its gold reserves. He believed trade should flow naturally based on which country can produce a specific good using the fewest resources. Which trade theory reflects this thinking? A. Absolute advantage. B. Comparative advantage. C. Factor endowment theory. D. Global strategic rivalry theory. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Absolute advantage. Explanation: Option A is correct because Adam Smith's absolute advantage theory states that trade should flow according to market forces. With countries exporting goods, they can produce more efficiently, using fewer resources than any other nation. Option B is incorrect because comparative advantage was developed by David Ricardo and focuses on opportunity cost rather than absolute efficiency, arguing that specialization is beneficial even if one country produces all goods more efficiently than another. Option C is incorrect because factor endowment theory, developed by Heckscher and Olin, argues that comparative advantage arises from a country's abundance of specific production factors like land, labor, and capital, rather than simple production efficiency. Option D is incorrect because global strategic rivalry theory from the 1980s focuses on how multinational corporations develop sustainable competitive advantages through barriers to entry, not on national production efficiency or resource usage. This question takes us to Adam Smith's absolute advantage, which came before Ricardo's comparative advantage in the timeline of trade theory. Smith argued in 1776 that a nation's true wealth should be measured by its people's living standards, not by how much gold is sitting in the treasury. And he believed trade should flow naturally based on which country can produce a specific good using the fewest resources. That's absolute advantage, pure efficiency. Who makes it best with the least? No opportunity cost analysis, no relative comparisons, just straight up productivity. Comparative advantage came later from David Ricardo, and it added the layer of opportunity cost. Even if one country is better at producing everything, Ricardo said both nations still benefit from specializing based on relative sacrifice. Factor endowment theory from Heckscher and Olin goes further still. It says comparative advantage comes from a country's abundance of specific production factors like land, labor, and capital. And global strategic rivalry theory is from the 1980s, focused on how modern corporations build competitive advantages through barriers to entry. Completely different era, completely different focus. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. Adam Smith plus fewest resources plus natural market forces equals absolute advantage. If the question references Smith by name or talks about producing with fewer resources than anyone else, that's your answer. Quick recall hook: absolute equals absolutely the best. Fewest resources, most efficient. 18. A country with a massive population and very low wages has become the world leader in manufacturing labor-intensive goods like textiles and assembled electronics. This advantage stems directly from its abundant and affordable workforce. Which international trade theory best explains why this country dominates these specific industries? A. Mercantilism. B. Country similarity theory. C. Heckscher-Olin theory. D. Absolute advantage. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer C. Heckscher-Olin theory. Explanation: option C is correct because the Heckscher-Olin theory states that a country gains comparative advantage by producing goods that use its abundant factors of production, such as large, cheap labor pools being optimal for labor-intensive industries. Option A is incorrect because mercantilism focuses on achieving a trade surplus through protectionist policies and accumulating gold reserves, not on explaining why specific countries dominate certain industries based on their abundant production factors. Option B is incorrect because country similarity theory explains trade between nations at similar stages of development with similar consumer preferences, not the advantage gained from having an abundance of inexpensive labor for manufacturing. Option D is incorrect because absolute advantage simply identifies which country produces a good using fewer resources overall, without explaining the underlying reason related to factor abundance, such as a large low-cost labor pool. This question tests the Heckscher-Olin theory, also called factor endowment theory, and it comes down to one idea: countries dominate industries that match their abundant resources. The scenario describes a country with a massive population and very low wages that has become the world leader in labor-intensive manufacturing, textiles, assembled electronics. Its advantage comes directly from having an enormous and affordable workforce. That's exactly what Heckscher-Olin predicts. If a country has an abundance of cheap labor, it will gain a comparative advantage in goods that require lots of labor to produce. If a country has abundant capital, it'll dominate capital-intensive industries instead. Mercantilism is about trade surpluses and gold accumulation through protectionist policies. It doesn't explain why specific countries dominate specific industries based on what resources they have the most of. Country similarity theory explains why similar economies trade similar products back and forth. It doesn't address factor abundance at all. And absolute advantage just says who produces with fewer resources overall without digging into the underlying reason why. Heckscher-Olin answers the why, because of what you have the most of. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When a country dominates an industry because of abundant labor, land, or capital, that's Heckscher-Olin. The trigger words are abundant, factor of production, and endowment. Quick recall hook. Heckscher-Olin equals have a lot of something. Abundant factor drives your advantage. 19. Germany exports luxury automobiles to Japan while simultaneously importing Japanese luxury cars. Both countries have similar income levels, advanced manufacturing sectors, and consumers with comparable tastes in vehicle quality and design. Which trade theory best explains this two-way exchange within the same industry? A. Comparative advantage. B. Country similarity theory. C. Mercantilism. D. Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Do you know the answer? Correct answer B. Country similarity theory. Explanation: option B is correct because country similarity theory, developed by Stefan Linder, explains intra-industry trade by proposing that countries at similar stages of economic development with similar consumer preferences will successfully trade goods within the same industry.
Option A is incorrect because comparative advantage focuses on countries specializing in different goods based on opportunity cost, and it does not effectively explain why two nations would simultaneously trade the same category of product back and forth. Option C is incorrect because mercantilism advocates for maintaining a trade surplus by maximizing exports and minimizing imports, which contradicts the balanced two-way exchange of similar goods between nations described in this scenario. Option D is incorrect because Heckscher-Ohlin theory explains trade based on differences in factor endowments like land, labor, and capital abundance, not the exchange of similar products between equally developed nations with comparable resources.
Here's one that tests a trade theory students sometimes mix up with comparative advantage. Germany exports luxury cars to Japan. Japan exports luxury cars right back to Germany. Both countries have similar income levels, advanced manufacturing, and consumers who want similar quality and design. That two-way exchange of the same type of product is called intra-industry trade, and the theory that explains it is country similarity theory developed by Stefan Linder. Linder's idea is straightforward. Countries at similar stages of economic development with similar consumer preferences will end up trading goods within the same industry. They don't specialize in completely different things. They trade variants of the same thing because their consumers want similar products. Comparative advantage is about specializing in different goods based on opportunity cost. It doesn't explain why two rich countries would swap luxury cars with each other. Mercantilism wants more exports than imports. Balanced two-way trade in the same goods contradicts that entire philosophy. And Heckscher-Ohlin is about differences in factor endowments driving trade. Germany and Japan have comparable resources, so factor differences don't explain this pattern. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If two similar developed countries trade the same type of product back and forth, that's country similarity theory. The keywords are similar development, similar preferences, same industry. Quick recall hook: country similarity equals similar countries, similar stuff. Same type of goods flowing both ways. 20. A 16th century European nation believes its power depends entirely on accumulating gold and silver. It heavily taxes imported goods to discourage purchases from foreign producers while aggressively pushing its own products into overseas markets. Which early trade theory guided this strategy of maintaining a trade surplus? A. Mercantilism. B. Absolute advantage. C. Comparative advantage. D. Global strategic rivalry theory. What you think is the answer?
Correct answer, A. Mercantilism. Explanation: option A is correct because mercantilism, developed in the 16th century, holds that a country's wealth is determined by its gold and silver holdings, and nations should promote exports and discourage imports through protectionist policies. Option B is incorrect because absolute advantage focuses on natural market forces and efficient production, rather than the deliberate government strategy of taxing imports to accumulate precious metals. Option C is incorrect because comparative advantage focuses on opportunity cost and mutual benefit through specialization, not on restricting imports and accumulating gold and silver as measures of national wealth. Option D is incorrect because global strategic rivalry theory focuses on how modern multinational corporations create barriers to entry for competitive advantage, not 16th century government trade surplus strategies. Let's close out this set with the oldest trade theory on the list,
A 16th century European nation believes its power depends entirely on accumulating gold and silver. It taxes imported goods heavily to discourage purchases from foreign producers, while aggressively pushing its own products into overseas markets. That's mercantilism, the trade theory that says a country's wealth is measured by its gold and silver holdings, and the path to wealth is maintaining a trade surplus by exporting as much as possible while importing as little as possible. Governments use tariffs, quotas, and other protectionist policies to make this happen. Absolute advantage came later, from Adam Smith in 1776. Smith argued against mercantilism, saying trade should flow naturally based on who produces most efficiently, not through government manipulation. Comparative advantage, from David Ricardo, built on Smith's work by adding opportunity cost. Countries should specialize where they sacrifice the least. And global strategic rivalry theory didn't emerge until the 1980s, focusing on how modern multinational corporations create competitive advantages through barriers to entry. That's centuries removed from gold-hoarding monarchs. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If you see gold, silver, trade surplus, protectionist policies, and the 16th century, that's mercantilism without question. Quick recall hook. Mercantilism equals more gold, more power. Export lots, import little, hoard precious metals. 21. A government wants to protect its domestic steel industry from cheaper foreign imports. It decides to impose a fee on every ton of steel entering the country, which raises the price foreign producers must charge and makes domestic steel more competitive. What is this type of trade barrier called? A. Quota. B. Embargo. C. Tariff. D. Subsidy. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer C. Tariff. Explanation: option C is correct because a tariff is a tax imposed by a government on imported goods, which raises the price of foreign products and makes domestically produced goods more competitive by comparison in the local market. Option A is incorrect because a quota is a limitation on the quantity of goods that can be imported into a country, restricting the number of items allowed rather than adding a fee to increase the price of each imported product. Option B is incorrect because an embargo is a complete prohibition on trade with a specific country or region that bans all imports or exports, which is far more restrictive than simply adding a fee on certain imported goods. Option D is incorrect because a subsidy is a financial benefit provided by the government to support domestic producers or industries, which reduces their costs rather than increasing the price charged to foreign importers of competing goods. Let's get into trade barriers because this topic comes up frequently on the exam. The government wants to protect its domestic steel industry from cheaper foreign imports, so it imposes a fee on every ton of steel entering the country. That fee raises the price foreign producers must charge, which makes domestic steel more competitive. That fee is a tariff, a tax the government places on imported goods to make them more expensive, simple as that. A quota is different. A quota limits the quantity of goods that can come in. It doesn't add a fee, it puts a cap on the number of units. An embargo is the extreme version, a total ban on all trade with a specific country or region. No goods in, no goods out. Way more aggressive than just slapping a fee on steel imports. And a subsidy works on the opposite end. The government gives money to its own domestic producers to lower their costs rather than raising the price on foreign competitors. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question describes a fee or tax on imported goods, that's a tariff every single time. Tariff equals tax on imports. Quick recall hook. Tariff equals tax. Both start with T. 22. A nation decides that only 500,000 units of a specific foreign-made electronic device may enter its borders during the calendar year. Once that number is reached, no additional units of that device can be legally imported regardless of demand. What trade restriction is being applied? A. Tariff. B. Voluntary export restriction. C. Anti-dumping duty. D. Absolute quota. Do you know the answer?
Correct answer, D, absolute quota. Explanation, option D is correct because an absolute quota sets a firm limit on the total number of specific goods that may enter a country during a given period, and no additional units are allowed once that numerical cap is reached. Option A is incorrect because a tariff is a tax added to the price of imported goods, rather than a numerical limit on how many units of a product can enter the country, and tariffs do not block entry after a threshold. Option B is incorrect because a voluntary export restriction is an agreement where foreign firms voluntarily limit the number of goods they export to another country rather than a legally enforced import cap set by the receiving government. Option C is incorrect because an anti-dumping duty is an extra tariff levied on imports to neutralize unfairly low pricing by foreign producers who charge less in export markets than they do in their own home markets.
Now let's move from tariffs to quotas because the exam likes to test the difference. A nation says only 500,000 units of a specific foreign electronic device can enter the country during the calendar year. Once they hit that number, the door shuts. No more imports regardless of demand. That's an absolute quota. The word absolute is doing real work here. It means a hard, firm cap with no flexibility once the limit is reached. A tariff is a tax on imports. It raises the price but doesn't set a ceiling on how many units can enter. You could import 1 billion units if you pay the tax. A voluntary export restriction is when the exporting country's firms agree to limit their own exports. It's voluntary, not a legal cap imposed by the importing government. And an anti-dumping duty is an extra tariff specifically designed to counteract foreign companies selling products below their home market prices. That's about unfair pricing, not about capping the number of units allowed in. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question sets a specific numerical limit on imports and says no more are allowed after that number, it's an absolute quota. The keyword is firm limit. Quick recall hook, absolute quota equals absolute limit. Hit the number, the door closes. 23. A foreign television manufacturer sells its products in another country at prices significantly below what it charges customers in its own home market, aiming to undercut local competitors and capture market share quickly. What is this practice called, and what tool do governments commonly use to counteract it? A. Dumping, countered by anti-dumping tariffs. B. Outsourcing, countered by sanctions. C. Subsidizing, countered by embargoes. D. Monopolizing, countered by quotas. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Dumping, countered by anti-dumping tariffs. Explanation. Option A is correct because dumping is the practice of charging a lower price for a product in foreign markets than in the home market, and governments use anti-dumping tariffs, also known as countervailing duties, to neutralize this unfair pricing. Option B is incorrect because outsourcing refers to sending production work to locations with cheaper labor, not selling products below home market prices in foreign countries, and sanctions are political tools unrelated to addressing predatory pricing. Option C is incorrect because subsidizing means providing government financial support to domestic industries, not charging lower prices abroad than at home, and embargoes are complete trade bans unrelated to foreign pricing practices by individual firms. Option D is incorrect because monopolizing refers to one company dominating an entire market to eliminate competition, not the specific practice of pricing products lower in foreign markets, and quotas limit import quantities rather than addressing unfair pricing. This question pairs two concepts together: the unfair practice and the government's response. A foreign television manufacturer sells products in another country at prices way below what it charges in its own home market. The goal is to undercut local competitors and grab market share fast. That practice is called dumping, literally dumping cheap goods into a foreign market at artificially low prices. And the tool governments use to fight back? Anti-dumping tariffs, sometimes called countervailing duties. These are extra taxes slapped on the dumped goods to bring their prices back up to fair levels. Outsourcing is about relocating production to cheaper locations. It has nothing to do with selling below home market prices. Sanctions are political tools used against countries for policy reasons, not pricing tools. Subsidizing is when a government financially supports its own domestic industries, which is the reverse of what's described. And monopolizing means one company dominates an entire market. That's a market structure issue, not a pricing practice in foreign markets. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When a foreign company charges less abroad than at home to undercut competitors, that's dumping. The countermeasure is anti-dumping tariffs. These two always appear together. Quick recall hook: dumping equals dirt cheap abroad. The fix is anti-dumping tariffs. 24. A developing nation has just started building its own automobile industry, but its new car manufacturers cannot yet compete with well-established foreign automakers that have decades of experience and massive economies of scale. Which trade policy argument supports temporarily protecting this young domestic industry from foreign competition? A. Free trade argument. B. Infant industry argument. C. Anti-dumping argument. D. Sanctions argument. C. Do you know the answer? Correct answer B. Infant industry argument. Explanation option B is correct because the infant industry argument holds that newer industries in developing countries are vulnerable to more developed foreign counterparts and may need temporary government protection until they can compete effectively in the world market. Option A is incorrect because the free trade argument advocates for removing barriers to international trade to allow goods and services to flow freely based on comparative advantage, which would actually expose the young industry to immediate foreign competition. Option C is incorrect because the anti-dumping argument specifically addresses foreign companies selling goods below their home market prices to undercut competitors, not the general competitive disadvantage of a new domestic industry against established foreign firms. Option D is incorrect because sanctions are foreign policy tools used to restrict or abolish trade with specific countries as a political response to undesirable behavior by another nation, not a measure to protect young domestic industries. This question introduces one of the most commonly tested trade policy arguments. A developing nation just started building its own automobile industry, but its new car manufacturers can't compete with established foreign automakers that have decades of experience and massive economies of scale. The trade policy argument that supports protecting this young industry temporarily is the infant industry argument. The logic is simple. A brand new industry in a developing country is like an infant, small, weak, and vulnerable. It can't survive going head-to-head with giants right away. So the government shields it with tariffs or quotas until it grows strong enough to compete on its own in the global market. The key word is temporarily. The free trade argument goes the opposite direction. It says remove all barriers and let goods flow based on comparative advantage. That would crush this new industry immediately. The anti-dumping argument is specifically about foreign firms pricing below their home market rates, not about a new industry's general competitive weakness. And sanctions are political tools for punishing countries, not for nurturing young industries. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If a question describes a new or young industry in a developing country needing temporary protection from established foreign competition, that's the infant industry argument. The keywords are new, developing, and temporary. Quick recall hook: infant industry equals baby business. Too young to compete, needs temporary protection. 25. A coalition of nations decides to ban all trade with a specific country as a response to that country's military aggression against its neighbor. No goods, services, or financial transactions may cross borders with the targeted nation. Which trade management tool best describes this comprehensive action? A. Tariff. B. Quota. C. Sanction. D. Embargo. What you think is the answer? Correct answer D. Embargo. Explanation: Option D is correct because an embargo is a complete prohibition on trade with a specific country, banning all imports and exports, and it represents the most extreme form of trade restriction that can be applied against a nation. Option A is incorrect because a tariff is simply a tax imposed on imported or exported goods to raise their prices, which still allows trade to occur at a higher cost rather than completely banning all commercial exchange with a country. Option B is incorrect because a quota sets a numerical limit on the quantity of specific goods that can be imported, but does not constitute a total ban on all trade, services, and financial transactions with an entire country. Option C is incorrect because while sanctions are laws that restrict or reduce trade with certain countries as a foreign policy tool, an embargo is more specifically a complete prohibition of all trade, making it the more precise answer for a total ban. This one tests the most extreme trade restriction on the list. A coalition of nations bans all trade with a specific country because of military aggression against its neighbor. No goods, no services, no financial transactions. Absolutely nothing crosses the border. That's an embargo. An embargo is a complete prohibition on trade with a targeted country. It's the nuclear option of trade barriers. Everything stops. A tariff is just a tax on imports. Trade still happens, it just costs more. A tariff doesn't shut the door entirely. A quota sets a numerical limit on specific goods coming in, but it doesn't ban all trade across the board. And a sanction is close. Sanctions are laws that restrict or reduce trade as a foreign policy response. But the question describes a total ban, and an embargo is the more precise term for a complete prohibition. Sanctions can be partial, embargoes are absolute. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When you see a complete ban on all trade with a country, no exceptions, that's an embargo. If it's partial restrictions, think sanctions. If it's a fee, think tariff. Quick recall hook, embargo equals everything blocked, total trade shut down. 26. A multinational company is expanding into a country where laws are based on detailed written codes rooted in the Roman legal tradition. Judges in this country investigate the facts of each case rather than relying on prior court decisions to guide their rulings. Which legal system governs this country? A. Common law. B. Customary law. C. Civil law. D. Religious law. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Civil law. Explanation: Option C is correct because civil law has its basis in the Roman legal tradition, relies on a detailed set of written laws that constitute a code, and uses an inquisitorial system where an investigating judge examines the facts. Option A is incorrect because common law is based on traditions and legal precedent traced to the English monarchy, using an adversarial system where the judge acts as moderator between two opposing parties rather than investigating facts. Option B is incorrect because customary law is found in countries without strong formal justice systems, generally at the tribal or local level, based on long-standing local customs that are often transmitted orally rather than codified. Option D is incorrect because religious law, also known as theocratic law, is based on religious guidelines such as Islamic Sharia, Jewish halakha, or Christian canon law, not on codified Roman legal traditions with investigating judges. Now we're getting into legal systems, and this is a topic that trips students up because 4 distinct systems can appear on the exam. The question describes laws based on detailed written codes rooted in the Roman legal tradition, with judges who investigate the facts of each case rather than relying on prior court decisions. That's civil law. Civil law countries have thick, detailed legal codes that cover just about every situation. Judges act as investigators. They dig into the facts themselves. This is called an inquisitorial system. Common law, by contrast, traces back to the English monarchy. It uses an adversarial system where the judge acts as a neutral moderator between two opposing sides. And the big distinction: common law relies on precedent. Previous court rulings guide future decisions. Civil law doesn't work that way. Customary law is found in places without strong formal justice systems, usually at the tribal or local level. It's based on long-standing traditions passed down orally. And religious law, or theocratic law, is based on religious scriptures like Islamic Sharia, Jewish halakha, or Christian canon law. None of those match written codes from the Roman tradition.
Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. Roman tradition plus written codes plus investigating judges equals civil law. If the question mentions precedent and English tradition, that's common law. Quick recall hook: civil law equals codes. Written codes, Roman roots, investigating judges. 27. In the United States, a judge rules on a business dispute by interpreting existing statutes and referencing how similar cases were decided by previous courts. This prior ruling now sets a standard that future courts are expected to follow. Which legal system relies on this type of judicial precedent? A. Common law. B. Civil law. C. Religious law. D. Customary law.
Do you know the answer?
Correct answer, A. Common law. Explanation: option A is correct because common law is based on traditions and precedents, where judges interpret the law and judicial rulings can set precedent that guides future decisions in similar cases. Option B is incorrect because civil law relies on detailed written codes and judges focus on applying established statutes to the facts rather than creating binding precedent through individual court rulings. Option C is incorrect because religious law is based on religious guidelines and scriptures, and court decisions are guided by theological interpretation rather than secular judicial precedent from prior cases. Option D is incorrect because customary law operates at the tribal or local level, relying on long-standing oral traditions rather than formal judicial precedent established by previous court rulings. This question flips to the other major Western legal system. A judge in the United States rules on a business dispute by interpreting existing statutes and referencing how similar cases were decided by previous courts. That prior ruling now sets a standard that future courts follow. That's common law, built on the English monarchy tradition, where judicial precedent is king. Judges don't investigate facts the way civil law judges do. Instead, they act as moderators in an adversarial system where two sides present their arguments. When a judge makes a ruling, that ruling becomes precedent, a guide that future courts are expected to follow in similar situations. Civil law doesn't rely on precedent. Instead, judges apply detailed written codes directly to the facts they investigate. Religious law is guided by theological interpretation and scriptures, not secular court decisions from prior cases. And customary law operates at the tribal or local level through oral traditions. No formal court system, no written precedent. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions prior court decisions guiding future rulings, the word precedent, that's common law. Precedent equals common law every time. Quick recall hook: common law equals court precedent. Past decisions shape future rulings. 28. A foreign bank wants to offer financial products in a country governed by Islamic law. The bank discovers that charging interest on loans is prohibited under the prevailing legal framework, requiring them to develop entirely new asset-based financial instruments. Which type of legal system is creating this unique business constraint? A. Common law. B. Civil law. C. Customary law. D. Religious law.
What you think is the answer?
Correct answer, D. Religious law. Explanation: option D is correct because religious law, particularly Islamic Sharia, prohibits concepts like charging interest on loans, which has led to the development of unique asset-based financial products that comply with religious guidelines. Option A is incorrect because common law is a secular system based on English legal traditions and judicial precedent, and it does not contain religious prohibitions against interest or require asset-based financial products for compliance. Option B is incorrect because civil law is a secular system rooted in Roman legal tradition with detailed written codes, and it does not impose religious restrictions on financial practices, like the prohibition of interest charges on loans. Option C is incorrect because customary law operates at the tribal or local level based on long-standing oral traditions, and it does not typically impose specific religious financial requirements, like prohibiting interest on lending instruments. Here's a legal system question with a very specific clue built into it. A foreign bank wants to offer financial products in a country governed by Islamic law. The bank discovers that charging interest on loans is prohibited. They have to develop entirely new asset-based financial instruments to comply. That legal constraint comes from religious law, specifically Islamic Sharia. Religious law, also called theocratic law, is based on religious guidelines and scriptures. Under Sharia, charging interest, known as riba, is forbidden, which is why Islamic banking has created its own unique financial products based on profit sharing, leasing, and asset-backed structures instead of interest-bearing loans. Common law is a secular system based on English traditions and judicial precedent. It doesn't contain religious prohibitions about interest. Civil law is also secular, rooted in Roman written codes. No religious restrictions on financial products there either. And customary law is based on tribal traditions passed down orally. It doesn't typically impose specific religious financial rules either. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions prohibitions based on religious scripture, especially interest-free banking or Sharia, that's religious law. Quick recall hook: religious law equals religion rules. Scripture dictates the legal framework. 29. A company is evaluating legal risk before entering a foreign market. The assessment reveals that the country combines elements of codified statutes from its colonial past with locally practiced tribal customs that vary dramatically from region to region. Which term best describes this type of legal environment? A. Theocratic system. B. Hybrid legal system. C. Pure common law. D. Absolute civil code. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer: B. Hybrid legal system. Explanation: option B is correct because most countries have a combination of different legal traditions, creating hybrid legal systems, and analyzing the foundations of a country's legal system is essential for assessing the legal risk multinationals face. Option A is incorrect because a theocratic system is based specifically on religious guidelines and scripture, not the combination of colonial codified statutes with locally practiced tribal customs that varies from region to region across the country. Option C is incorrect because pure common law relies solely on English-rooted traditions and judicial precedent, and it would not include the tribal customs or codified colonial statutes that create the mixed legal environment described here. Option D is incorrect because an absolute civil code would consist entirely of detailed written statutes based on Roman tradition, without incorporating the locally practiced tribal customs that vary dramatically across different regional jurisdictions. This question tests a concept many students overlook: the fact that most countries don't run on one single, clean legal system. The scenario describes a country that combines codified statutes from its colonial past with locally practiced tribal customs that vary dramatically from region to region. That mix is a hybrid legal system. Most real-world countries have a combination of different legal traditions layered on top of each other. Colonial history left behind civil law or common law frameworks, but on the ground, local customary practices persisted. The result is a blend that companies have to navigate carefully. A theocratic system is based specifically on religious guidelines and scripture that doesn't match the colonial plus tribal mix described here. Pure common law would rely entirely on English-rooted traditions and precedent, with no tribal customs mixed in. And an absolute civil code would be nothing but detailed written statutes based on Roman tradition, with no room for varying regional tribal practices. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you.
If the question describes a mix of different legal traditions, colonial codes plus tribal customs, or written law plus religious law, that's a hybrid legal system. The keyword is combination. Quick recall hook. Hybrid equals mix of two or more. Multiple legal traditions coexisting. 30. In a remote rural community without a formal court system, disputes between families are settled based on traditions that elders have passed down through spoken word for generations. There are no written statutes or formal judges involved. Which type of legal system is this community following? A. Customary law. B. Civil law. C. Common law. D. Religious law. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Customary law. Explanation, option A is correct because customary law is found in communities without strong formal justice systems, generally operating at the tribal or local level based on long-standing local customs that are often transmitted orally across generations. Option B is incorrect because civil law requires a detailed set of written laws that constitute a formal code rooted in Roman legal tradition, with investigating judges operating within an established court system rather than oral traditions. Option C is incorrect because common law requires a formal judicial system where judges interpret statutes and reference prior court decisions to establish precedent, not an informal system of spoken traditions passed between community elders. Option D is incorrect because religious law is based on specific religious guidelines in scriptures such as Islamic Sharia or Jewish Halakha, not on the secular tribal customs and oral traditions that community elders pass down through generations. This wraps up the legal system set with the most basic and oldest form. A remote rural community has no formal court system. Disputes between families are settled based on traditions that elders have passed down through spoken word for generations. No written statutes, no formal judges. That's customary law. Customary law exists in communities without strong formal justice systems. It operates at the tribal or local level based on long-standing local customs transmitted orally from generation to generation. Civil law requires a detailed set of written codes rooted in Roman tradition, with investigating judges operating within an established court system. That's the opposite of oral traditions in a remote village. Common law requires a formal judicial system, where judges interpret statutes and reference prior court decisions. No formal system here means no common law. And religious law is based on specific religious scriptures like Sharia or Halakha, not on secular tribal customs passed down by community elders. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question describes no formal court system, elders settling disputes, oral traditions, and tribal or local customs, that's customary law. Quick recall hook. Customary equals custom of the community. Elders, oral traditions, no formal courts. 31. Representatives from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944 to create a new international monetary system. Two major institutions emerged from that meeting. One was designed to help manage currency exchange and provide loans to correct trade imbalances. Which institution is this? A. The World Trade Organization. B. The World Bank. C. The United Nations. D. The International Monetary Fund. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. The International Monetary Fund. Explanation, option D is correct because the IMF was created at Bretton Woods in 1944 with the primary purpose of helping manage the fixed-rate currency exchange system and eventually evolved to help governments correct trade imbalances through loans. Option A is incorrect because the World Trade Organization was not created at Bretton Woods, but rather evolved from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and was formally established in 1995 to govern global trade rules. Option B is incorrect because while the World Bank was also created at Bretton Woods, its primary purpose was financing post-war European reconstruction and later economic development in poorer nations, not managing currency exchange systems. Option C is incorrect because the United Nations is a separate international organization focused on maintaining international peace, security, and cooperation among nations, and it was not one of the two institutions established at the Bretton Woods Conference. This takes us to the Bretton Woods Conference, which is foundational for understanding international economics. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to build a new international monetary system. Two major institutions came out of that meeting. The question asks about the one designed to help manage currency exchange and provide loans to correct trade imbalances. That's the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF was built to oversee the fixed-rate currency exchange system and help countries that ran into trade balance problems by providing short-term loans. The World Trade Organization wasn't created at Bretton Woods. It came much later. The WTO evolved from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and was formally established in 1995. The World Bank was created at Bretton Woods, yes, but its purpose was financing post-war European reconstruction and later economic development in poorer nations. Different mission from currency management. And the United Nations is focused on international peace, security, and cooperation among nations. It wasn't one of the two Bretton Woods institutions. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. Bretton Woods produced two institutions, IMF for currency and trade balance, World Bank for reconstruction and development. If the question asks about currency management, it's IMF. Quick recall hook. IMF equals International Money Fix, fixing currency and trade balance problems. 32. The IMF created an international monetary reserve asset in 1969, whose value is based on a basket of 5 major world currencies. Countries are allocated units of this asset which they can include in their reserves and exchange with other nations. What is this reserve asset called? A. Foreign direct investment credit. B. Most favored nation bond. C. Special drawing right. D. Quantitative performance note. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer C. Special drawing right. Explanation. Option C is correct because a special drawing right is an international monetary reserve asset created in 1969 by the IMF, valued on a basket of 5 currencies and serving as the unit of account that countries can hold in reserves. Option A is incorrect because foreign direct investment credit is not a recognized IMF reserve instrument, and foreign direct investment refers to investing in or acquiring foreign assets with the intent to control and manage them for long-term purposes. Option B is incorrect because most favored nation is a trade principle under the World Trade Organization requiring equal treatment of all member nations, not a monetary reserve asset created by the International Monetary Fund for exchange between countries. Option D is incorrect because quantitative performance criteria are specific measurable conditions the IMF sets as part of its loan conditionality requirements, not a tradable reserve asset that countries hold and exchange with one another. This builds directly on the Bretton Woods and IMF foundation. In 1969, the IMF created an international monetary reserve asset whose value is based on a basket of 5 major world currencies. Countries get allocated units of this asset, which they can hold in their reserves and exchange with other nations. That asset is the special drawing right, or SDR. Think of it as a kind of international currency backup, not actual money you spend, but a reserve asset that gives countries more financial flexibility. Its value is drawn from a basket of 5 currencies, which is why it's called a drawing right. Foreign direct investment credit isn't a real IMF instrument. FDI refers to investing in foreign assets with the intent to control and manage them. Most favored nation is a WTO trade principle about equal treatment, not a monetary reserve asset. And quantitative performance criteria are specific conditions the IMF attaches to its loans. They're part of the conditionality framework, not something countries hold in their reserves and trade with each other. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. if the question mentions an IMF reserve asset based on a basket of currencies created in 1969. That's the special drawing right. Quick recall hook. SDR equals special drawing right, a basket of currencies you can draw on. 33. A struggling nation applies for IMF financial assistance, but learns it must first implement specific policy reforms and meet measurable economic targets before and during the loan period. The IMF requires these changes instead of traditional collateral. What is this practice called? A. IMF conditionality. B. Structural adjustment lending. C. Portfolio diversification. D. Trade liberalization mandate. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. IMF conditionality. Explanation: Option A is correct because IMF conditionality is the set of policies or conditions the IMF requires in exchange for financial resources, mandating that governments correct the financial practices that led to their debt through policy reform. Option B is incorrect because structural adjustment lending is a broader term sometimes associated with World Bank programs and does not precisely describe the IMF's specific four-part framework of prior actions, quantitative criteria, indicative targets, and benchmarks. Option C is incorrect because portfolio diversification is an investment strategy used by individuals and firms to spread risk across different assets, not a lending requirement imposed by the International Monetary Fund on borrowing nations. Option D is incorrect because trade liberalization mandate refers to reducing trade barriers and opening markets to foreign competition, which may be one component of reform but does not capture the full scope of IMF lending conditions. This question goes deeper into how the IMF actually works with struggling nations. A country applies for IMF financial assistance and learns it must implement specific policy reforms and meet measurable economic targets before and during the loan period. The IMF requires these changes instead of traditional collateral. That practice is called IMF conditionality. The IMF doesn't just hand over money, it demands that governments fix the financial practices that got them into debt. Conditionality has a specific four-part framework: prior actions, things you must do before getting the money; quantitative performance criteria, measurable targets; indicative targets, softer goals; and structural benchmarks, reform milestones. Structural adjustment lending is a broader term sometimes linked to the World Bank. It doesn't capture the IMF's specific framework. Portfolio diversification is an investment strategy for spreading risk across different assets. That's a private finance concept, not an IMF lending practice. And trade liberalization mandate describes one possible reform component, opening up markets, but it's just one piece of the broader conditionality package, not the whole thing. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When the IMF requires policy reforms and economic targets in exchange for a loan, that's conditionality. Think of it as conditions attached to the cash. Quick recall hook: conditionality equals conditions for cash, reforms before you get the money. 34. The World Bank Group consists of 5 institutions working together on economic development. One of these institutions specifically provides political risk insurance and guarantees to investors and lenders who are concerned about instability in the countries where they want to invest. Which institution serves this function? A. International Development Association. B. International Finance Corporation. C. International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. D. Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. Explanation: Option D is correct because the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, known as MIGA, specifically offers political risk insurance and guarantees to investors and lenders who face instability concerns in the countries where they invest.
Option A is incorrect because the International Development Association provides interest-free loans and grants to the governments of the poorest countries for economic development, not political risk insurance or investment guarantees for private investors. Option B is incorrect because the International Finance Corporation is the largest global development institution focused exclusively on the private sector in developing countries, providing financing and advisory services rather than political risk insurance. Option C is incorrect because the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes provides international facilities for conciliation and arbitration of investment disputes between nations and investors, not insurance against political risks. The World Bank Group has 5 institutions, and this question asks about the one that handles political risk insurance. An investor or lender wants to put money into a developing country but worries about political instability, things like government seizure of assets, currency restrictions, or civil unrest. The institution that provides insurance and guarantees against those risks is MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. MIGA's whole job is to make investors feel safe enough to put their money into risky markets by covering the political downside. The International Development Association, or IDA, gives interest-free loans and grants to the poorest countries' governments. That's about development funding, not investment insurance. The International Finance Corporation, or IFC, works with the private sector in developing countries, providing financing and advisory services, but it doesn't offer political risk insurance. And the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID, provides a place for countries and investors to settle disputes through conciliation and arbitration. That's dispute resolution, not insurance against political risk. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question asks about political risk insurance or investment guarantees, the answer is MIGA. Quick recall hook: MIGA equals my investment guaranteed, political risk covered. 35. Critics argue that when the IMF lends to struggling nations, the required austerity measures like reducing government borrowing and raising interest rates often hurt the poorest citizens the most. Additionally, voting power is based on economic size, giving wealthier nations a disproportionate voice. Which 2 major criticisms does this reflect? A. Environmental concerns and trade diversion. B. Conditionality, harming citizens and administrative underrepresentation. C. Lack of transparency and currency manipulation. D. Leadership imbalance and monopoly creation. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer: B. Conditionality, harming citizens and administrative underrepresentation. Explanation: Option B is correct because critics argue IMF conditionality requiring austerity measures makes conditions worse for struggling populations, and voting shares based on economic size result in poorer countries being underrepresented in decisions. Option A is incorrect because environmental concerns relate to exploitation of natural resources to repay loans, and trade diversion is a criticism of regional trading blocs, neither of which addresses the austerity or voting representation issues described. Option C is incorrect because lack of transparency and currency manipulation are not the specific paired criticisms described here, which focus on the harmful effects of austerity conditions on citizens and the unequal distribution of voting power. Option D is incorrect because while leadership imbalance partially relates to representation, monopoly creation is a concern associated with multinational corporations and trade agreements rather than a direct criticism of the IMF's lending practices. This question asks you to identify 2 specific criticisms of the IMF. The first criticism: austerity measures like reducing government borrowing and raising interest rates required by the IMF often hurt the poorest citizens the most. That's the conditionality problem. The conditions attached to IMF loans can make life worse for the people who are already struggling. The second criticism: voting power in the IMF is based on economic size, which means wealthier nations have a disproportionate voice, while poorer nations are underrepresented in decisions that directly affect them.
That's administrative underrepresentation. Together, these two criticisms are conditionality, harming citizens, and administrative underrepresentation. Environmental concerns and trade diversion are real issues but belong to different debates. Environmental exploitation relates to resource use for debt repayment, and trade diversion is a criticism of regional trade blocs, not the IMF. Lack of transparency and currency manipulation don't pair together as described in this scenario, and leadership imbalance partially overlaps with the representation issue, but monopoly creation is associated with multinational corporations, not the IMF's lending practices. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When austerity hurts citizens and poor countries lack voting power, those are the two paired IMF criticisms: conditionality, harm, and underrepresentation. Quick recall hook: IMF criticism equals tough conditions plus unfair votes. The poor suffer and can't change the rules. 36. After World War II, nations agreed to work together to promote free trade, resulting in a multilateral instrument that governed global trade for nearly 5 decades. In 1995, this instrument evolved into a permanent organization with a broader mandate. What was the original instrument and what did it become? A. The IMF evolved into the World Bank. B. The Marshall Plan evolved into the European Union. C. GATT evolved into the WTO. D. The Bretton Woods system evolved into the SDR. Do you know the answer? Correct answer: C. GATT evolved into the WTO. Explanation: Option C is correct because the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was the only multilateral instrument governing global trade from 1946 until 1995, when it evolved into the World Trade Organization. Option A is incorrect because the IMF and the World Bank were created as two separate institutions at Bretton Woods in 1944, and one did not evolve from the other. Both continue to operate independently today. Option B is incorrect because the Marshall Plan was a United States program for post-war European economic recovery, and while European cooperation eventually led to the European Union, the EU did not directly evolve from the Marshall Plan. Option D is incorrect because the Bretton Woods system was a fixed exchange rate arrangement, and the special drawing right was created by the IMF in 1969 as a reserve asset, not as an evolution of the entire Bretton Woods framework. This question covers one of the most important transitions in international trade history. After World War II, nations wanted to promote free trade, and they created a multilateral instrument called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. GATT governed global trade for nearly 5 decades, from 1946 to 1995. Then in 1995, it evolved into a permanent organization with a broader mandate, the World Trade Organization, or WTO. So the answer is GATT evolved into the WTO. The IMF and the World Bank were created as two separate institutions at Bretton Woods in 1944. One did not evolve from the other. They've always been independent. The Marshall Plan was a U.S. program for post-war European economic recovery. European cooperation eventually contributed to what became the EU, but the EU didn't directly evolve from the Marshall Plan, and the Bretton Woods system was a fixed exchange rate arrangement, while the special drawing right was created by the IMF in 1969 as a reserve asset. The SDR didn't replace the Bretton Woods system. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. GATT governed trade from 1946 to 1995, then became the WTO. If the question mentions a multilateral trade instrument evolving into a permanent organization, that's the GATT to WTO transition. Quick recall hooks: GATT became WTO, agreement became organization. 37. Under WTO rules, if country A grants favorable trade terms, such as lower tariffs, to country B, it must automatically extend those same terms to every other WTO member nation. No single country can receive better treatment than another. What is this fundamental WTO principle called? A. Most favored nation status. B. Infant industry protection. C. voluntary export restriction, D, absolute quota requirement. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A, most favored nation status. Explanation: option A is correct because the most favored nation principle requires every WTO member to apply the same trade terms and conditions to all other WTO members, ensuring non-discrimination in trade agreements across the organization. Option B is incorrect because infant industry protection is a trade policy argument that supports temporarily shielding new domestic industries from foreign competition until they are strong enough to compete in the global market. Option C is incorrect because a voluntary export restriction is an agreement where foreign firms choose to limit the number of goods they export to another country, which is an informal trade barrier rather than a principle of equal treatment. Option D is incorrect because an absolute quota requirement is a hard limit on the number of specific goods that can be imported into a country, and it restricts quantity rather than establishing equal trade terms across member nations. This question tests the most fundamental WTO principle. Under WTO rules, if country A grants favorable trade terms, like lower tariffs, to country B, it must automatically extend those same terms to every other WTO member. Nobody gets special treatment. That's the most favored nation principle, or MFN. The name is a bit misleading. It doesn't mean one nation is favored. It actually means every nation gets the same deal. Whatever the best terms are that you give to any member, all members get those terms automatically. Non-discrimination is the whole point. Infant industry protection is a trade policy argument for temporarily shielding new industries in developing countries. It's a justification for trade barriers, not a WTO principle about equal treatment. A voluntary export restriction is when foreign firms agree to limit their own exports. That's an informal trade barrier, not a WTO rule. And an absolute quota is a hard cap on imports. It restricts quantity, not establishes equality of treatment. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question says equal trade terms must be extended to all WTO members, no special deals, that's most favored nation. The concept is non-discrimination. Quick recall hook: MFN equals same deal for all members. Favor one, favor everyone. 38. The Uruguay round of trade negotiations, adopted in 1994, achieved a dramatic reduction in global trade barriers and also established protections for patents, copyrights, and trademarks across member nations. What is the agreement that specifically governs these intellectual property protections? A. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. B. The Doha Development Agenda. C. The Bretton Woods Agreement. D. The TRIPS Agreement. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D, the TRIPS Agreement. Explanation: option D is correct because the trade-related aspects of Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, known as TRIPS, was established during the Uruguay round to provide international protection for patents, copyrights, and trademarks. Option A is incorrect because the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is the broader umbrella treaty governing trade in goods that existed before the WTO, and it does not specifically focus on intellectual property rights protection. Option B is incorrect because the Doha Development Agenda is the subsequent round of trade negotiations started in 2001, focused on reducing farm subsidies in developed countries, and has shown limited progress toward completion. Option C is incorrect because the Bretton Woods Agreement established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in 1944 to manage currency exchange and economic development, not intellectual property protections. This question gets into a specific agreement that came out of one of the biggest trade negotiation rounds in history. The Uruguay round, adopted in 1994, cut global trade barriers dramatically and also created protections for intellectual property, patents, copyrights, and trademarks across member nations. The agreement that specifically governs those IP protections is TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreement. TRIPS was a game-changer because before it, intellectual property protections varied wildly from country to country. TRIPS created a minimum standard that all WTO members had to follow. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is the broader umbrella treaty about trade in goods. It doesn't zero in on intellectual property. The Doha Development Agenda is the next round of negotiations that started in 2001. It's focused on farm subsidies in developed countries and hasn't made much progress. And the Bretton Woods Agreement from 1944 created the IMF and World Bank. It's about monetary systems, not intellectual property. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions patents, copyrights, trademarks, and the Uruguay round, that's TRIPS, intellectual property protection across WTO members. Quick recall hook, TRIPS equals trade-related IP, patents, copyrights, trademarks protected internationally. 39. Critics argue that the WTO's requirement for nations to undergo trade policy reviews effectively limits their ability to set independent economic strategies. Some developing nations feel they cannot use the same protectionist tools that wealthy nations once relied upon during their own development phases. Which two criticisms does this reflect? A. Environmental damage and labor exploitation. B. Leadership imbalance and conditionality. C. Compromised national sovereignty and protection of developed nations. D. Currency manipulation and trade diversion. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Compromised national sovereignty and protection of developed nations. Explanation. Option C is correct because critics say the WTO's trade policy reviews compromise national sovereignty and rules prohibiting protectionist tools that developed countries once used during their own development unfairly protect wealthy nations over poorer ones. Option A is incorrect because environmental damage and labor exploitation are separate WTO criticisms related to the organization's failure to enforce environmental standards and high labor protections, not the sovereignty and development fairness concerns described. Option B is incorrect because leadership imbalance and conditionality are criticisms primarily directed at the IMF and World Bank regarding their voting structures and loan requirements, not at the WTO's trade policy review process. Option D is incorrect because currency manipulation relates to exchange rate policies managed by central banks and the IMF, and trade diversion is a criticism of regional trading blocs, neither of which addresses the WTO-specific sovereignty concerns described. This question pairs two specific WTO criticisms together. First, the WTO's trade policy reviews effectively limit nations' ability to set their own independent economic strategies. That's the sovereignty issue. Countries feel like the WTO is telling them what they can and can't do, which compromises their national sovereignty. Second, developing nations feel they can't use the same protectionist tools that wealthy nations relied on during their own development phases. Rich countries industrialized behind tariff walls and subsidies, but now WTO rules prevent poorer countries from doing the same thing. That's protection of developed nations at the expense of developing ones. Together, these are compromised national sovereignty and protection of developed nations. Environmental damage and labor exploitation are separate WTO criticisms about environmental standards and working conditions. Valid concerns, but different from what's described here. Leadership imbalance and conditionality are IMF and World Bank criticisms, not WTO specific. And currency manipulation is about exchange rate policies managed by central banks, while trade diversion relates to regional trading blocs. Neither addresses the WTO's sovereignty and development fairness issues. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question mentions WTO limiting national policy choices and preventing developing countries from using protectionist tools, those are sovereignty concerns plus unfair protection of wealthy nations. Quick recall hook. WTO criticism equals sovereignty lost plus rich nations protected. Developing countries can't play by the same rules. 40. Two WTO member nations disagree about whether one country's new import regulations unfairly restrict the other's products. They need a neutral forum where they can formally present their arguments and reach a resolution under international trade rules. Which WTO function addresses this need? A. Dispute settlement. B. Trade policy transparency. C. Developing nation assistance. D. Public outreach. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Dispute settlement. Explanation: Option A is correct because one of the most important functions of the WTO is to provide a forum for negotiations and settling disputes among member nations when disagreements arise over trade rules and regulations. Option B is incorrect because trade policy transparency requires all WTO members to publish and undergo review of their trade regulations for openness, but it does not provide a mechanism for formally resolving disputes between countries. Option C is incorrect because developing nation assistance involves providing training and support to ensure the WTO is inclusive and equitable for poorer countries, not serving as a forum for resolving specific bilateral trade disagreements. Option D is incorrect because public outreach refers to the WTO's function of maintaining a dialogue with non-governmental organizations, the media, and the general public, not resolving formal trade disputes between member governments. Let's round out this set with one of the WTO's most important functions. Two WTO member nations disagree about whether one country's import regulations unfairly restrict the other's products. They need a neutral forum to formally present their arguments and reach a resolution under international trade rules. That function is dispute settlement. Dispute settlement is one of the WTO's core responsibilities, providing a structured forum where member nations can bring trade disagreements, present evidence, and get a ruling based on international trade law. Without it, trade disputes would just escalate into trade wars. Trade policy transparency is a different WTO function. It requires members to publish their trade regulations and undergo reviews for openness. That's about visibility, not about resolving conflicts between countries. Developing nation assistance is about training and support to help poorer countries participate in the global trading system. It's about inclusion, not adjudication. And public outreach is the WTO's function of maintaining dialogue with NGOs, the media, and the public. That's communication, not dispute resolution. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. When two countries have a trade disagreement and need a neutral forum for resolution, that's the WTO's dispute settlement function. The keyword is neutral forum, quick recall hook. Dispute settlement equals the WTO's courtroom. Two countries argue, WTO settles it. 41. An investor purchases shares in a foreign company's stock purely to earn financial returns and diversify a portfolio. The investor has no intention of managing or controlling the company's daily operations or strategic direction. Which type of international investment does this represent? A. Horizontal foreign direct investment. B. Portfolio investment. C. Greenfield investment. D. Vertical foreign direct investment. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Portfolio investment. Explanation: Option B is correct because portfolio investment involves investing in a company's stocks, bonds, or assets without the intent to control or direct the firm's operations, with the primary goal being financial returns and risk diversification. Option A is incorrect because horizontal foreign direct investment involves a company establishing the same type of business operation in a foreign country to serve that local market, which requires active management and operational control. Option C is incorrect because a greenfield investment involves building entirely new facilities like factories or stores from the ground up in a developing country, which represents a direct and active commitment to managing foreign operations. Option D is incorrect because vertical foreign direct investment involves a company investing internationally within its own supply chain, either backward into production facilities or forward into distribution, both requiring direct operational control. Alright, let's get into the different types of international investment, because the exam loves testing whether you can tell them apart. An investor purchases shares in a foreign company's stock purely to earn financial returns and diversify their portfolio. They have zero intention of managing or controlling the company. That's portfolio investment. The defining feature of portfolio investment is passivity. You buy stocks, bonds, or other financial assets in a foreign company, collect your returns, and that's it. You have no say in how the company runs. No operational control, no strategic direction. Horizontal foreign direct investment is a completely different animal. That's when a company sets up the same type of business operation in a foreign country to serve local customers there. Think of a fast food chain opening restaurants abroad. That requires active management. Greenfield investment means building brand new facilities from scratch in a foreign country. Factories, stores, offices. That's a massive operational commitment. And vertical foreign direct investment involves investing along your own supply chain internationally, either backward into production or forward into distribution. All three FDI types require hands-on control. Portfolio investment doesn't. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the investor has no control and no management intent, just buying stocks or bonds for returns, that's portfolio investment. The keyword is no control. Quick recall hook. Portfolio equals passive. Buy shares, collect returns, stay hands-off. 42. A large retail chain based in France decides to build brand new stores in Brazil from the ground up, creating hundreds of long-term jobs in the local community. No existing facilities are purchased or leased in this expansion. Which specific type of foreign direct investment does this construction of new facilities represent? A. Brownfield investment. B. Portfolio investment. C. Backward vertical investment. D. Greenfield investment. Do you know the answer? Correct answer D. Greenfield investment. Explanation: Option D is correct because greenfield foreign direct investment occurs when multinational corporations enter developing countries to build new factories or stores from the ground up, creating new long-term jobs in the host community. Option A is incorrect because brownfield investment involves purchasing or leasing existing production facilities to launch new activities, which is typically less expensive and faster to implement than building entirely new structures from scratch. Option B is incorrect because portfolio investment involves buying stocks, bonds, or other financial assets in a foreign company for financial returns and risk diversification without any intent to build facilities or control business operations. Option C is incorrect because backward vertical investment specifically means investing in production facilities in another country to supply parts or raw materials for the final product, not building retail stores to sell directly to consumers. Now let's look at the opposite end of the investment spectrum from portfolio. A large French retail chain decides to build brand new stores in Brazil from the ground up. No existing facilities are purchased or leased. Hundreds of long-term jobs get created in the local community. That's greenfield investment, foreign direct investment where you start with a literal green field and build everything from scratch. New construction, new jobs, new operations. The term comes from construction. Imagine building on an empty green field with nothing on it. Brownfield investment is close but different. Brownfield means you buy or lease existing facilities and use them for new activities. It's faster and cheaper than building from scratch, but the question specifically says no existing facilities were purchased. Portfolio investment is buying stocks and bonds for financial returns. No facility construction, no operational control. And backward vertical investment means investing in production facilities abroad to supply parts or raw materials for your final product. The French company is building retail stores to sell to consumers, not factories to supply a production line. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question says building new facilities from the ground up with no existing structures purchased, that's greenfield. If they buy or lease existing facilities, That's brownfield, quick recall hook. Greenfield equals ground up, brand new construction on empty land. 43. A host government creates a designated geographic area near its major port where foreign companies receive special tax incentives, relaxed regulations, and streamlined customs procedures. The goal is to attract foreign manufacturers, create local jobs, and increase the country's export volume. What is this designated area commonly called? A. Special Economic Zone. B. Free Trade Area. C. Customs Union Territory. D. Common Market Region. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Special Economic Zone. Explanation: Option A is correct because export processing zones or special economic zones are designated geographic areas with different business regulations specifically designed to encourage foreign investment, create jobs, and boost export activity. Option B is incorrect because a free trade area is a form of regional economic integration where member countries remove trade barriers among themselves while maintaining independent external policies, not a designated geographic zone within one country. Option C is incorrect because a customs union territory refers to a regional trade agreement where member nations adopt a common external trade policy with non-member countries, not a domestic zone with special incentives for foreign investors. Option D is incorrect because a common market region is a stage of regional economic integration that allows free movement of labor, capital, and technology between member countries, not a specific geographic zone within one country offering investment incentives. This question tests a concept that sometimes gets confused with regional trade agreements. A host government creates a designated geographic area near its major port. Foreign companies operating inside that zone get special tax incentives, relaxed regulations, and streamlined customs procedures. The goal is to attract foreign manufacturers, create local jobs, and boost exports. That designated area is a special economic zone, also called an export processing zone. These zones exist within a single country. The government carves out a specific geographic area and gives it different business rules to attract foreign investment. They're a host government incentive, not a multinational agreement. A free trade area is a form of regional economic integration between multiple countries that remove trade barriers among themselves. That's a multi-nation agreement, not a zone within one country. A customs union territory involves multiple nations adopting a common external trade policy, again, multiple countries cooperating, and a common market region allows free movement of labor, capital, and technology between member countries. Same deal. It's about relationships between nations, not a specific zone with tax breaks inside one country. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the question describes a designated zone within one country offering tax breaks, relaxed rules, and customs streamlining to attract foreign companies, that's a special economic zone. The keyword is designated area within a single country. Quick recall hook. SS equals special zone, special rules. A carved-out area with incentives. 44. A government decides to take over a foreign-owned oil company's assets and operations within its borders, claiming that control of energy resources is vital to national interests and security. The foreign company loses ownership without agreement. What is this government action called? A. Mandatory local sourcing. B. Outsourcing. C. Expropriation. D. Ownership restriction. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Expropriation. Explanation: Option C is correct because expropriation occurs when a government chooses to take over foreign-owned assets to nationalize critical industries, transferring ownership and control from the foreign investor to the state for national interest reasons. Option A is incorrect because mandatory local sourcing requires foreign investors to purchase a certain percentage of goods from host country suppliers, which is a condition placed on operations rather than a seizure of ownership and assets. Option B is incorrect because outsourcing is the practice of sending production work to locations with cheaper labor, which is a voluntary business strategy by companies and not a government action to seize foreign-owned business assets. Option D is incorrect because ownership restrictions are government regulations that limit the percentage of a business that foreign investors can own, keeping control in local hands rather than forcibly taking over assets already owned by foreign companies. This question introduces a concept that represents one of the biggest risks for foreign investors. A government decides to take over a foreign-owned oil company's assets and operations within its borders, claiming that control of energy resources is vital to national interests and security. The foreign company loses ownership without agreeing to it. That's expropriation, when a government seizes foreign-owned assets to nationalize an industry. The key elements are government action, seizure of ownership, and the claim of national interest. It's involuntary from the company's perspective. Mandatory local sourcing is a different kind of host government restriction. It requires foreign investors to buy a certain percentage of goods from local suppliers. That's a condition on how you operate, not a seizure of your entire business. Outsourcing is a voluntary company strategy, sending production to cheaper locations. It's initiated by the business, not forced by a government, and ownership restrictions limit the percentage a foreign investor can own in a company. The government says you can only own 49%, for example. That's controlling how much you can own going forward. It's not taking away assets you already have. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the government forcibly takes over foreign-owned assets for national interest reasons, that's expropriation. The trigger words are government takeover, seize, and nationalize. Quick recall hook. Expropriation equals exit your property. The government takes what's yours. 45. A car manufacturer headquartered in Japan invests in a parts factory in Thailand to produce engines that will be shipped back to Japan for final assembly. This investment moves backward along the company's supply chain to secure a production input. Which type of foreign direct investment is this? A. Forward vertical FDI. B. Horizontal FDI. C. Portfolio investment. D. Backward vertical FDI. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, D. Backward vertical FDI. Explanation option D is correct because backward vertical foreign direct investment occurs when a company invests in production facilities in another country to supply parts or raw materials that feed back into the final product assembly process. Option A is incorrect because forward vertical foreign direct investment involves investing in distribution facilities in a foreign country to sell finished goods into that market, which moves forward toward the customer rather than backward along the supply chain. Option B is incorrect because horizontal foreign direct investment involves establishing the same type of business operation in a foreign market to serve local customers there, rather than investing backward in the supply chain for component production. Option C is incorrect because portfolio investment means purchasing stocks, bonds, or other financial assets in a foreign company purely for financial returns and diversification without any intent to control operations or establish production facilities. This question digs into the direction of investment within a company's supply chain. A Japanese car manufacturer invests in a parts factory in Thailand to produce engines that get shipped back to Japan for final assembly. The investment moves backward along the supply chain, away from the customer and toward raw materials and components. That's backward vertical FDI. Think of the supply chain as a timeline. Raw materials and parts come first, backward, and distribution and sales come last, forward. When a company invests in production facilities in another country to supply components that feed back into the final product, they're going backward. Forward vertical FDI is the opposite direction, investing in distribution facilities in a foreign country to sell finished goods. That moves toward the customer, not away from them. Horizontal FDI means setting up the same type of business operation in a foreign market. A Japanese car company opening car dealerships in Thailand to sell to Thai consumers would be horizontal, same business, different country, And portfolio investment is buying stocks or bonds with no operational control. Building a factory is about as hands-on as it gets. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the investment moves toward parts and raw materials, back up the supply chain, that's backward vertical FDI. If it moves toward the customer through distribution, that's forward. Quick recall hook, backward equals back to parts, forward equals forward to customers. 46. 3 neighboring countries agree to eliminate all tariffs and quotas on goods traded between them, but each country keeps its own independent trade policies when dealing with nations outside their agreement. Which is the most basic level of regional economic integration this arrangement represents? A. Free trade area, B. Customs union, C. Common market, D. Economic union. What you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Free trade area. Explanation: Option A is correct because a free trade area is the most basic form of regional economic integration, where member countries remove all barriers to trade among themselves but maintain their own independent external trade policies with non-members. Option B is incorrect because a customs union goes further than a free trade area by requiring members to not only remove internal trade barriers but also adopt a common external trade policy applied uniformly to all non-member countries. Option C is incorrect because a common market goes beyond a customs union by additionally allowing the free movement of factors of production such as labor, capital, and technology between member countries across their borders. Option D is incorrect because an economic union is a much deeper form of integration, where members adopt common economic policies, may use a single shared currency, harmonize tax systems, and coordinate monetary and fiscal policies together. Now we're into regional economic integration, and this topic tests a specific hierarchy you need to memorize. 3 neighboring countries agree to eliminate all tariffs and quotas on goods traded between them, but each keeps its own independent trade policies when dealing with outsiders. That's a free trade area, the most basic level of regional economic integration. The key distinguishing feature is that internal barriers are gone, but external policies remain independent. Each country can set its own tariffs and rules for nations outside the agreement. A customs union takes it one step further. Members not only remove internal barriers but also adopt a common external trade policy. Everyone charges the same tariffs to outsiders. A common market goes further still by adding the free movement of labor, capital, and technology between member countries on top of everything the customs union already does. And an economic union is the deepest form. Members adopt common economic policies, may share a single currency, harmonize taxes, and coordinate monetary and fiscal policies. The question specifically says each country keeps independent external policies, which rules out everything above a free trade area. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If internal barriers are removed but external trade policies stay independent, that's a free trade area. The moment you see common external policy, you've moved up to a customs union. Quick recall hook. Free trade area equals free inside, independent outside. 47. A group of nations has removed all internal trade barriers, adopted a shared external tariff on goods from non-member countries, and now allows workers, investors, and technology to move freely across their borders without restriction. Which stage of regional economic integration have they reached? A. Free trade area, B. Common market, C. Customs union, D. Political union. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Common market. Explanation: Option B is correct because a common market goes beyond a customs union by allowing the free movement of factors of production, including labor, capital, and technology, between member countries, in addition to having removed trade barriers.
Option A is incorrect because a free trade area only removes internal trade barriers like tariffs and quotas among members, while allowing each country to maintain independent external trade policies without free movement of labor or capital. Option C is incorrect because a customs union removes internal trade barriers and adopts a common external tariff but does not include the free movement of workers, investors, and technology across member country borders. Option D is incorrect because a political union is the highest level of integration, where members unify all policies including economic, foreign, and defense, essentially behaving as a single country, which goes far beyond what is described here.
This question moves up the integration ladder to the third level. A group of nations has removed all internal trade barriers, adopted a shared external tariff, and now allows workers, investors, and technology to move freely across borders without restriction. That's a common market. A common market includes everything a customs union has, no internal barriers plus a common external tariff, and then adds the free movement of factors of production. Factors of production means labor, capital, and technology. When workers and investors can cross borders freely, you've gone beyond a customs union into common market territory.
A free trade area only removes internal barriers. Each country keeps its own external policies. There's no shared external tariff and definitely no free movement of people. A customs union adds the common external tariff, but it stops there. Workers and investors can't just cross borders freely under a customs union arrangement. And a political union is the highest level. Members unify all policies including economic, foreign, and defense. They essentially act as a single country. That goes way beyond what's described in this scenario. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. The thing that separates a common market from a customs union is the free movement of labor, capital, and technology. If workers and investors move freely across borders, you're at common market level. Quick recall hook. Common market equals common movement. People, money, and technology flow freely. 48. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement replaced an earlier trade deal and introduced several new provisions, including stronger intellectual property protections, a rule requiring a high percentage of auto components to be manufactured within member countries, and a sunset clause for periodic review. Which earlier agreement did it replace? A. CAFTA-DR, B. Mercosur, C. NAFTA, D. ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. NAFTA. Explanation: Option C is correct because the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement in 2019, adding stronger intellectual property protections, auto component origin rules, and a 16-year sunset clause. Option A is incorrect because CAFTA-DR is the Central America Free Trade Agreement involving the United States and several Central American nations plus the Dominican Republic, and it was not replaced by the USMCA agreement. Option B is incorrect because Mercosur is a South American economic and political agreement originally between Brazil and Argentina, later expanded to include Uruguay and Paraguay, and it operates independently of any North American trade agreements. Option D is incorrect because the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement involves Southeast Asian nations focused on economic cooperation and regional stability, and it has no connection to the trade relationship between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. This is a straight-up factual recall question, and it's one the exam loves to test. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, replaced an earlier trade deal and brought in new provisions, stronger intellectual property protections, a rule that a high percentage of auto components must be manufactured within member countries, and a 16-year sunset clause for periodic review. The agreement it replaced was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA had been in place since 1994 and was one of the most significant regional trade agreements in history. The USMCA replaced it in 2019. CAFTA-DR is the Central America Free Trade Agreement involving the U.S. and Central American nations plus the Dominican Republic. Completely different region, different agreement.
Mercosur is a South American economic bloc, originally between Brazil and Argentina, later expanded. It has nothing to do with North American trade. And the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement involves Southeast Asian nations. No connection whatsoever to the US, Mexico, and Canada relationship.
Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. USMCA replaced NAFTA in 2019. If the question mentions US, Mexico, Canada, and a replacement agreement, the old one is NAFTA. Quick recall hook: USMCA replaced NAFTA. New Deal, same three countries. 49. An American tourist traveling through Europe discovers that each dollar now buys significantly more euros than it did last year. While this is great news for the tourist's vacation budget, American exporters are struggling because their products have become more expensive for European buyers. What has happened to the dollar? A. It has depreciated against the euro. B. It has been pegged to the euro. C. It has entered a managed float. D. It has appreciated against the euro.
What you think is the answer?
Correct answer, D. It has appreciated against the euro. Explanation: Option D is correct because when a currency appreciates or strengthens, its exchange rate rises, so it buys more of other currencies, which benefits tourists abroad but hurts exporters because their goods become more expensive for foreign customers. Option A is incorrect because depreciation means the dollar's exchange rate has fallen, meaning it would buy fewer euros and American goods would become cheaper for foreign buyers, which is the opposite of the scenario described here. Option B is incorrect because a pegged currency is one whose value is fixed to another currency or asset at a set rate by the government. And pegging does not describe the natural market-driven change in purchasing power described in this scenario. Option C is incorrect because a managed float describes a regime where central banks attempt to influence exchange rates by buying and selling currencies, which is a policy approach rather than a description of what happened to the dollar's value. This question tests currency appreciation, and it uses a real-world scenario to make it click. An American tourist in Europe discovers that each dollar now buys significantly more euros than it did last year. Great for the tourist's vacation budget, but American exporters are struggling because their products have become more expensive for European buyers. What happened to the dollar? It appreciated against the euro. Appreciation means a currency gets stronger. Its exchange rate rises, so it buys more of other currencies. That's a double-edged sword. Tourists love it because their money stretches further abroad, but exporters hate it because when the dollar is strong, American goods cost more in foreign currencies, which makes them harder to sell overseas.
Depreciation is the opposite. The dollar weakens, buys fewer euros, and American goods become cheaper for foreign buyers. That's the reverse of this scenario. A pegged currency has its value fixed to another currency at a set rate by the government. The scenario describes a natural market-driven change, not a government-imposed fixed rate. And a managed float is a policy approach where central banks try to influence exchange rates. That describes a system, not what happened to the dollar's value. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the dollar buys more foreign currency, it appreciated. If it buys less, it depreciated. Remember that appreciation helps tourists but hurts exporters. Quick recall hook: appreciation equals your currency goes up. Buys more abroad, but your exports cost more. 50. A developing country's government wants to maintain a constant value for its currency against the United States dollar. The central bank commits to buying and selling its own currency at a set price, holding reserves of dollars and gold to defend this rate. However, this policy limits the government's ability to address other economic problems. Which exchange rate system is this country using? A. Fixed exchange rate. B. Floating exchange rate. C. Pegged float exchange rate. D. Crawling band system. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer: A. Fixed exchange rate. Explanation: Option A is correct because under a fixed exchange rate system, a government maintains a constant currency value against a specific currency or asset, with the central bank buying and selling at a fixed price but losing flexibility in monetary and fiscal policy. Option B is incorrect because a floating exchange rate allows a currency's value to fluctuate freely according to supply and demand in the foreign exchange market, without the central bank committing to defend a specific set price. Option C is incorrect because a pegged float exchange rate is a hybrid system where the currency is tied to some value or band but is allowed to fluctuate within that band, rather than being held at one constant fixed price. Option D is incorrect because a crawling band system allows the currency to fluctuate within a band that is periodically adjusted by the central bank over time, which provides more flexibility than the rigid constant value described here. Let's finish with exchange rate systems because this is a clean way to close out the course material. A developing country's government wants to maintain a constant value for its currency against the US dollar. The central bank commits to buying and selling its own currency at a set price, holding reserves of dollars and gold to defend this rate. But this policy limits the government's ability to address other economic problems. That's a fixed exchange rate system. Under a fixed system, the government locks its currency's value to another currency or asset and defends that rate by buying and selling currency from its reserves. The trade-off is that you lose flexibility. You can't easily adjust monetary or fiscal policy because you're spending resources defending the rate. A floating exchange rate is the opposite. The currency's value moves freely based on supply and demand in the foreign exchange market. No government commitment to defend a specific price. A pegged float is a hybrid. The currency is tied to a value or band but can fluctuate within that range. It's more flexible than a full fix. And a crawling band system allows the currency to move within a band that the central bank adjusts periodically over time. More flexibility than either a fixed rate or a pegged float. The question describes a rigid constant defended rate, that's fixed. Here's a WGU D080 OA exam tip for you. If the government commits to maintaining a constant value by buying and selling currency at a set price, that's a fixed exchange rate. The trade-off is lost policy flexibility. Quick recall hook. Fixed equals frozen in place. One rate, defended by the central bank, no wiggle room. You have reached the end of our first question set. For the free complete exam preparation, visit our website, link in the description, where you find thousands more practice questions and comprehensive study guides. Thanks for studying with us today. See you in the next video.